Hi, in this video, I'm going to go over the third passage from the reading comprehension section for Prep Test 83. Okay, so we've got a passage A, which means we've also got a passage B, and it's comparative. Alrighty. Comedians are not amused when their jokes are stolen. And for that reason, we might expect joke stealing disputes to ripen into lawsuits occasionally. Copyright is the most relevant body of law. Formally, it applies to jokes and comedic routines. Yet copyright infringement lawsuits between rival comedians are all but unheard of, despite what appears to be a persistent practice of joke stealing among stand-up comedians. Okay, interesting. So why aren't comedians filing lawsuits against one another? All right, the non-existence of such lawsuits is a product of both practical considerations, right, that render the cost of enforcing the formal law prohibitively expensive, and legal hurdles, so practical considerations and legal hurdles that make success difficult and uncertain in lawsuits related to joke stealing. All right, so that's interesting. Why would it be more difficult and uncertain than other kinds of copyright infringement situations, like, let's say, in music? In the end, copyright law simply does not provide comedians with a cost-effective way of protecting their comedic material. So this looks like it's, at the very least, the conclusion for the first paragraph. Conventional intellectual property wisdom holds that absent formal legal protection, there would be scant production of creative works, as potential creators would be deterred by the unlikelihood of recouping the cost of their creations. If there is no effective legal protection against joke theft, then why do thousands of comedians keep cranking out new material night after night? The answer to this question is that in stand-up comedy, social norms substitute for intellectual property law. Okay. Taken as a whole, this norm system governs a wide array of issues that generally parallel those ordered by copyright law. These norms are not merely hortatory. Actually, I've never seen that word before. That's fun. Okay. Although, I mean, at some point I probably did write this section, but I don't recall seeing that word. They are enforced with sanctions. Okay, so there are actually consequences, right? Like there is actually an enforcement. So they're not, yeah, I'm still not getting like a very precise meaning for these words here, but merely hortatory, I think, would be something that you wouldn't expect to be enforced with sanctions. So, so if it is, they're not just hortatory. I'm probably not even pronouncing that right. Okay, so that would be, I mean, anytime you come across a word that you're not familiar with, you can go ahead and write that down. And usually I look up not just in a dictionary or for the definition, but I also look up synonyms, and I wouldn't use a physical dictionary, just, Google it. But yeah, that would go on my list. Okay. So these sanctions include simple bad-mouthing and refusals to work with an offending comedian. So these are like social sanctions, right? They're not legal sanctions. So these sanctions, while extra legal, right, outside of the law, can cause serious reputational harm to an alleged joke thief and may substantially hamper a comedian's career. Using this informal system, comedians are able to assert ownership of jokes, regulate their use and transfer, impose sanctions on transgressors, and maintain substantial incentives to invest in new material. Yeah, so I mean, the the big issue that's dealt with in this passage, we see popping up in this middle paragraph, and then the answer is social norms, right? So that's detailed in the last paragraph. So let's see what passage B is all about. Chefs. All right. Accomplished chefs consider their recipes to be a very valuable form of intellectual property. So once again, we're talking about intellectual property law. At the same time, recipes are not a form of innovation that is effectively covered by current intellectual property laws. Recipes are rarely patentable, and combinations of ingredients cannot be copyrighted. Okay, so that's interesting, right? In this case, it's actually just that like the law doesn't allow for that. Whereas in the comedian's case, right, copyright law would apply to jokes and comedic routines, right? It's just that the stand-up comedians don't use it, and there are reasons for that, right? There are some difficulties and uncertainties, and also in the law, and then practical considerations in that it's just very expensive. But in this case, yeah, it's rarely patentable, and combinations of ingredients cannot be copyrighted. So copyright law not helpful here. Legal protections are potentially available via trade secrecy laws, but chefs very seldom use them. Okay, interesting. So potentially available trade secrecy laws, chefs very seldom use them. Instead, 3 implicit social norms. So once again, we're using social norms instead of the law, the formal legal system. 3 implicit social norms are operative among chefs, and together these norms function in a manner quite similar to law-based intellectual property systems. First, a chef must not copy another chef's recipe innovation exactly. The function of this norm is analogous to patenting in that the community acknowledges the right of a recipe inventor to exclude others from practicing his or her invention, even if all the information required to do so is publicly available. A second norm mandates that if a chef reveals recipe-related secret information to a colleague, that colleague must not pass the information on to others without permission. This norm gives a chef a property right similar to that attainable under a contract by a trade secrecy law. A third norm is that colleagues must credit developers of significant recipes as the authors of that information. This norm operates in a manner analogous to copyright protection. So this is interesting because, I mean, it doesn't really get into how any of these norms would be enforced within the community of chefs. Yeah, I mean, it seems to provide some kind of protection, but are they enforced with sanctions? We don't know. So that would certainly be a difference between these two passages, that one of them goes into how enforcement is carried out and the other one does not. All right, so both passages are primarily concerned with investigating which one of the following topics: the legal protections available to creators of intellectual property. Yeah, I mean, we've got chefs and comedians, both creators of intellectual property, and they're talking about legal protections. I mean, this doesn't get into the social norms aspect, so I would be sort of interested in seeing more of that in one of these answer choices. So I could find a better answer. B, the connection between the enforcement of social norms and the incentives these norms provide to creators of intellectual property. So passage B doesn't talk about enforcement. C, the extent to which the rights of creators of intellectual property must be balanced against the social value of making that property publicly available. No, so we're not talking about balancing it with like an open source kind of situation. D, the practical considerations that prompt creators of intellectual property to forego legal protections of their work. So again, passage B doesn't really talk about the practical considerations of why. More just, it just says chefs very seldom use them, doesn't say why. And that's not really the main concern. So I like E, the ways in which social norms can take the place of laws in protecting intellectual property. Excuse me, I do like that one. So I would go with E. A, again, yeah, just legal protections not covering enough of what, like the real substance of the passages. So like a relevant topic that overlaps with the passages, but not the primary concern. Okay, next one. Passage A, but not passage B, discusses, and I mentioned this already, the enforcement of social norms. Which one of the following questions is addressed by passage A, but not by passage B with respect to the group of professionals discussed? All right, how can members of the group share their creative work with colleagues without sacrificing their intellectual property rights? I believe that was discussed in passage B, right? That they would share with colleagues. So why do members of the group usually not make use of the legal protections that are potentially available to them? Yeah, so they don't really talk about that here. I mean, you could answer it a little bit, but it wouldn't be a complete answer like we get in passage A, where they talk about practical considerations and legal hurdles, and yeah, really like answer that question properly. So I'm going to leave B for now. C, to what extent can patent law protect the creative output of members of the group? To what extent? So patent law, is patent law included here? I don't think so, just copyright law, so not specifically patent law, and I believe patents, yeah, rarely patentable, so that's not going to work. D, what is a form of creative output that members of the group regard as intellectual property? So we know that for both. What social norms prohibit members of the group from violating the intellectual? Yeah, so social norms, we know both of them for the group. So I believe it would be this one where it's answered much more directly in A, and yeah, not quite enough in B. Yeah, we'd have to take some logical leaps there, which we don't want to do. So that's the correct answer. The author of passage A would be most likely to agree with which one of the following statements? Comedians rarely acknowledge the degree to which their own comedic material is influenced by the work of their peers. No idea. Comedians would be more likely to protect their comedic material through copyright law if they had greater assurance that they could successfully bring infringement lawsuits against perceived perpetrators of joke theft. Yeah, so I do think that the author would agree with this because one of the reasons given for the non-existence of these lawsuits, so like for not bringing these lawsuits, is that it's legal hurdles make success difficult and uncertain. So if there was more assurance of success, then probably they would. So I do like B, but let's look at the other answers. Creative rights to jokes and comedic routines should be protected by trade secrecy law rather than copyright law. No, that was applying to recipes. D, the system of social norms operative among comedians is not robust enough to allow comedians to be properly compensated for the expenses they incur. So this is, yeah, talking about social norms, and yeah, we're talking about, like when we talk about expense, no, I think actually the author would disagree with this and would think that the system of social norms is robust enough, which is why they're relying on that system rather than going to court over it. In the particular context of stand-up comedy, no informal system for protecting intellectual property can be as effective as a formal system. No, it seems that the informal system is doing the job that we would often use like intellectual property law for. So yeah, I would go with B. Which one of the following statements is most strongly supported by information given in the passages? A, intellectual property violations are more frequent among comedians than among chefs. The frequency of violations, I really don't think that is mentioned. B, a more elaborate system of social norms has developed among chefs than among comedians. I don't think so. Yeah. The passage B maybe goes into the norms in like a more organized way, right? With those 3 norms specifically, but the norm system mentioned in passage A governs a wide array of issues. So how elaborate the systems are, we can't say. C, chefs enjoy more significant legal protections of their intellectual property than do comedians. No reason to think that because legal protections are maybe available through trade secrecy that they would be more significant. Most comedians and chefs are satisfied with current intellectual property laws. Again, no idea about that. All right, so let's see. Comedians and chefs both derive some professional benefit from observing the social norms of their profession. Yeah, I would think so. Yeah. So certainly for comedians, I mean, you're avoiding the sanctions. And then for chefs, the recipe inventor is then able to exclude others. So there's a professional benefit there, right? And that you get kind of a monopoly over the things that you create. Yeah, all right, let's keep moving. 18. The relationship described in passage A as holding between comedians and copyright law is most analogous to the relationship described in passage B as holding between chefs and which one of the following? And that would be trade secrecy law, I would think. Yeah, okay. So yeah, that legal protections are potentially available via trade secrecy law, but chefs very seldom use them, just like copyright law is the most relevant body of law for jokes and comedic routines, but we don't see, we see a non-existence of such lawsuits. The author of passage A, would be most likely to agree with which one of the following statements? A, the social norms that are operative among comedians make it possible for individual comedians to recoup the costs associated with developing a comedic routine. Yeah, I believe that is the case. Yeah, so the answer to the question of why are comedians still cranking out new material, even though they don't have that legal protection, right? It's because they have the social norms. So I like A. Comedians should increase their reliance on copyright law. No, the author seems to be pretty neutral, I guess, about the fact that comedians are not using copyright law, right? That just saying they've found an alternative. This is what they are doing. C, most professional comedians are largely unconcerned with the expense involved in developing new comedic material. Not sure that that's the case. Yeah, that's certainly the answer to why they continue to develop new comedic material isn't that they don't care about the expense. It's that there are actually enforcements for joke theft. So if that's the case, then probably they do care, right? They've made an investment in developing this material, so they don't want other people to just go and steal it. D, law-based intellectual property systems generally work less efficiently than systems based on social norms. I think generally, we've only got 2 examples here, and for passage A, we've only got 1 example, so I would eliminate that one, but I do think that there's like some evidence that the author would agree with that statement. So we could keep it as like a second best option. Existing copyright law should be modified to make it more cost effective. Yeah, I don't think that the author comes to like a prescriptive conclusion here of what they think should be the case. They're just talking about what is the case. I would go with A. All right, 20. Which one of the following, if true, would most clearly support the argument made in passage B? All right. A, there is no social norm preventing chefs from using colleagues' recipes as inspiration as long as those recipes are not copied exactly. This isn't really supporting the argument that social norms are what the chefs are using instead of trade secrecy laws. B, chefs are significantly more likely to deny requested information to colleagues whom they believe have violated the operative social norms. So this would, it would support the argument that that social norm is operating in a way that's protecting copyright, right? That there's some kind of there is actually some enforcement of those social norms, so it can actually operate like the law. Let's see. Recipes published in cookbooks are protected by copyright law from being published in other cookbooks. No, so there's no copyright law protection, right? Or at least, yeah, rarely patentable combinations that can't be copyrighted. Eliminate that. The community of chefs is too small to effectively enforce sanctions against those who violate. So if that's the case, then the norms are not going to operate very well if there's no enforcement. E, in practice, it is virtually impossible to determine whether a chef has copied a colleague's recipe exactly or has instead independently developed that recipe. Well, in that case, you are going to have this norm that a chef must not copy, or that you can exclude others from practicing that invention. Again, even if the information is publicly available, they're still saying that it's a norm not to copy that exactly. So if it were virtually impossible, then you wouldn't be able to use that norm as a replacement for law-based intellectual property systems. All right, so yeah, that's passage 3 from this section. If you have any follow-up questions, please let me know.